Cabeza de Vaca was part of an expedition to Florida involving hundreds of men and a number of ships. On this expedition, Cabeza de Vaca was the treasurer. Even before he reached Florida, the expedition had faced storms, some of the crew had deserted, and there were many other problems. To get a sense of the historical context, it might be helpful to think of what was going on at the time in the Americas and in Europe. Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked 35 years after Columbus stumbled upon the Western Hemisphere in 1492. So this is quite early in Spain's colonial enterprise. By 1494, Spain and Portugal, Western Europe's naval powers, had agreed to divide the world into halves and each colonize a half. Just a few years after Columbus's first journey, Spain started devoting significant energy to colonizing the Americas. Spain certainly did this for gold, but there's a lot of debate among historians about whether or not colonization was ever economically profitable. And there's no evidence of a rise in average wages in Spain during this period, for example. So it's hard to say that Spain got rich. People tend to focus on the Spanish search for precious metals, which is without a doubt a big part of Cabeza de Vaca's story. However, it is not accurate to say that the Spanish were only interested in gold. Many Spaniards felt that they had a special, divine mission to bring Christianity to the Americas. It's easy to be skeptical about Spanish missionary activity, but it's also important to take seriously the genuine religious conviction that led many missionaries, priests, and friars to leave Spain for the Americas. I say this because Emilio tells me that religious belief will play a big role in the story of Cabeza de Vaca. Spain made catastrophic mistakes that led to the misery and death of millions of people. But they weren't unique in their belief that they were exceptionally blessed by God and called to export their values to other cultures. That kind of thinking is still routinely informs political discourse and policy. What else was happening in the 1520s? Well, speaking of the search for precious metals, a pivotal moment in the development of colonial resource extraction was the conquest of Mexico, which happened in 1521, just a few years before Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked. So things are moving very quickly in the 35 years after Columbus's first arrival in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. I'll review things really quickly. In 1492, as we know, Columbus undertakes his first trip to what would be the Americas. In 1494, Spain and Portugal agreed to divide up the colonization of the globe. By 1521, Hernán Cortés has conquered the Aztec and annexed Mexico. And in 1527, Cabeza de Vaca starts his 8-year odyssey across what is today the southern United States. There's just one more social revolution that I should mention before we move on to look closer at Cabeza de Vaca. He was shipwrecked in Florida 10 years after the Protestant Reformation started in Germany. Starting in 1517, the Reformation changed political, economic, and religious alliances forever. There was conflict, certainly, and very expensive wars across Europe. We tend to think that we're living in a world that is rapidly changing. People of Cabeza de Vaca's time felt the same way. There was suddenly, from the European perspective, a new world to explore. There were huge changes in religious life of the 16th century in Europe, in patterns of daily life, and so on. As travel across the Atlantic became more routine, there were new foods to be eaten on both sides of the ocean. And tragically, there were new diseases and plagues, new ways to die. It was an incredibly tumultuous time.